Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Elearning Unlocked podcast. I'm Gill, the founder of Little Man Project. We're a bespoke development company that specialises in developing learning experiences for charities and the third sector. This podcast runs alongside our eLearning Unlocked blended learning programme. This programme supports learning and development professionals in charities to design effective e-learning for their staff and volunteers.
I'm really pleased to be joined today by Ross Dickie from Mind Tools. If you're a fan of L&D podcasts, then you'll probably be familiar with the weekly show that he co-hosts with the rest of the Mind Tools team. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Ross. Would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about what you do on a day-to-day basis at Mind Tools when you're not hosting the podcast?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm a learning experience consultant at Mind Tools. I've been with Mind Tools for 9 years now, which is hard to believe. And as you said, I'm one of the hosts of the Mind Tools L&D podcast. I also write the L&D Dispatch with Ross Garner. And day to day, I'm sort of working on large client projects focused around learning design and consultancy.
I'd recommend both the podcast and the dispatch. I'll put links in the show notes to both of those. You know, they're really accessible and enjoyable. So yeah, definitely recommend.
Oh, thank you.
So in terms of why I've asked you here today, we've started looking at evaluation as our last unit in the eLearning Unlocked programme. I've heard you talk quite a few times about evaluation over the last year or so. So aside from it being an opportunity just to geek out with someone who's also interested in evaluation, I wondered if you could explain why you're so interested in it when obviously most of what you do is designing e-learning itself. Why does this fit into that process and why is that particularly important to you?
It's funny because when you asked me to appear on the show, you mentioned that I've been talking about measurement and evaluation a lot this year on the podcast and in the newsletter. And I hadn't really realized it, but I think it basically does come up in every episode of the Mind Tools podcast that I'm involved in. I do focus on it a lot in the newsletter. I think when I started in this role as a learning designer, I was really just overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that there was to do and making sure the client was happy and figuring out my way around authoring tools and making nice learning content. And because we're a vendor, we're sort of separated from the measurement and evaluation piece. And there was just so much to get my head around. I thought, focus on that first. I think the longer I've worked in this role, that stuff has become not easy, but easier. And I think just as part of my sort of ongoing motivation and fulfillment in the job that I do, I like to think that the materials I'm designing, whether that's an e-learning course or a workshop or whatever it might be, is actually having an impact and making a difference in the organizations, and maybe this is a bit grandiose, but in people's lives more broadly. So that's kind of why I've been especially focused on it in recent years. I think the reason that I talk about it on the podcast so much is because it's a challenging topic. It feels like one of these big things that throughout the time that I've been hosting the Mind Tools podcast, people have been speaking about the challenge of measuring impact, of sort of demonstrating value to the business. People are still having those conversations. We're having that conversation today. It's not a solved problem, so it's quite a thorny, sticky issue to get your head around, which is fun. And then I think commercially, a little more grubbily, you kind of want to work with clients who care about measuring what they're doing. Earlier this year, I completed Will Thalheimer's LTEM bootcamp, and in that bootcamp, Will had a nice way of sort of framing measurement and the kind of purpose of measurement, why it's important. And he talked about measurement as fulfilling kind of three key functions. So supporting learners. So that's, can we provide them with feedback in terms of assessment scores, that sort of thing, helping them see where they've got wrong and where they can still develop, helping them address gaps, proving learning. That's the kind of demonstrating impact piece, is like has somebody actually learned something, and then has that had an impact on the business? And then finally, improving learning. So figuring out for us as learning designers, what parts of this experience work well, what parts could be improved, and how can we iterate and make it better going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a fan of Will and his book as well. I haven't done the programme, so I'm really interested to hear from you about your experiences and whether you think it's kind of a good, valuable activity. I think it's really interesting because you kind of touched on the fact that we're talking a lot in L&D about evaluation and this kind of pushback on the idea that people are just recording, factual based information on the LMS, like how many people completed the module and did they pass it? And that's really easy to record. And it's right that we should be thinking much deeper about the benefit to the organisation and whether those learning interventions are actually changing behaviour. But one of the things that struck me when I was writing the unit for eLearning Unlocked was how important from a developer's perspective and also the learner's perspective is, did they actually enjoy the experience? We know that enjoying something doesn't prove behaviour change, but we also know that a really awful module can change behaviour. But I'd much rather be building things that people like.
That'd be
and
nice.
If we don't ask them, we don't know if we're building things they like. So I 100% want to focus on behaviour change, but
I think that that's something that I've changed my views on just in the sort of past year or so. Is I think I would have been quite dismissive of that, because I think that's the quote unquote smart position to take on L&D, Twitter or LinkedIn.
Happy sheets are bad.
Yeah, exactly. Happy sheets are bad. We want to have more sophisticated measurement than satisfaction and engagement. And I think that is true. But if people don't engage with something in the first place, then you have no option or opportunity to change behavior. And then I think it also just stands to reason kind of intuitively, and this is backed up by some of the research that we've done within Mind Tools, that if people do enjoy an experience, that's more likely to lead to positive behavior change in some aspect. I think about it in terms of like my own career trajectory. Like, I studied languages in university. Part of the reason I studied languages is because I liked language classes in high school, because I had good teachers who were able to get me inspired about that topic, and that made me want to go and follow up more. So it's intuitively true that it does matter, but it's quite easy to be dismissive of it and think, well, it doesn't really matter if they liked it or not, as long as they've learned something. But also affects your reputation within L&D if you're wanting people to engage with the stuff you're doing outside of that particular experience you're designing. Then it's a good thing if we can design stuff that people actually enjoy and want to do more of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But weirdly, I've come in from the opposite direction of you, because I kind of always thought that people had to enjoy the e-learning to change. And then I did a really terrible piece of e-learning, ironically, not one, obviously, that we'd created or you'd created, but I learned something from it. And it really struck me that I've spent years wanting people to like and to do good e-learning, but they can still learn from terrible. But that's not to say that, as humans, as developers, that we want to gift the world with terrible e-learning. We want to create good quality things that people enjoy doing and that they're not kind of having to struggle through. Anyway, we came to the same point by the end. I just think that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us about the stuff you've learned on Will's program. Would you recommend that to others? I'll obviously put links in the show notes, but, is it valuable or is the book enough?
It was definitely valuable. I think what was nice about it and what was interesting to me was the different perspectives the delegates on the program brought to the LTEM model. Is it worth kind of going through the LTEM model for listeners? Sure. So it's an 8-tier model split into learning, which has 6 tiers, and then work, which has 2 tiers. So it begins with attendance, which is sort of engagement. Has someone completed course or attended a workshop? Activity, are they actually kind of engaging, completing activities within that experience? Learner perceptions, which is then where, and there's kind of 2 different ways of approaching this. Will has a book about how to create good learner surveys called performance focused learner surveys. You also get the kind of typical stuff, which is like, did they enjoy it, sort of happy sheets that we're talking about, which are maybe less effective. Knowledge, so can learners respond to knowledge-based questions within the intervention? Decision-making competence, where you're testing people's ability to make decisions in realistic practice scenarios. Task competence, so again, within the scope of the intervention, either within a piece of e-learning or within a workshop, can they actually perform the tasks that you're hoping them to learn? And then the work level, tier 7, you have transfer. So can they actually take what they've learned and apply it back in the workplace? And then tier 8 is effects of transfer. So that's the return on investment, increase sales for sales training, that sort of stuff, that high level metric that we're always trying to get to. And I think one of the big things I took away from the bootcamp is that I was obsessed with tier 8. I was absolutely determined to get like hard business metrics that we can say we did this thing and it led to increased sales, I don't know, higher retention, lower attrition, something that we could quantifiably point to and say this is what we achieved. And I think one of the key takeaways I got from the bootcamp was that a sort of mixed methods approach is going to be more useful there, because there's various factors that could lead to that. So if we use sales training, which is the easiest example, your sales could increase for any number of external factors that have nothing to do with whatever intervention you designed. So combining that, looking at that quantitative measure and then combining it with, say, something from tier 5, so decision-making competence, can learners within the scope of your intervention correctly answer realistic practice scenarios? What are their perceptions of the experience? So are they saying they're likely to take what they've learned and apply it in the workplace? Have they completed it? All these things do factor in and sort of increase your certainty that this change that you're seeing at the top of that, the framework at tier 8, is being driven by the experience that you've designed.
And interestingly, if it isn't, if you don't have the other measures, I think that's the thing that struck me. So, if you're going for the best, which is obviously what we all want to do, when it doesn't get reached, how do you know why? If you haven't captured any of the other data, if you didn't do it if they didn't do it because of the environment, if the sales team were told that they should be selling, not training,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know why they haven't reached 8 until you actually dig into that other data and find that out.
Yeah.
So that was the thing I loved about the model. It's this idea that you want 8.
Yeah.
But actually getting all the data is also really useful. But it's also about finding that balance between capturing data all day long and what's useful.
Yeah.
And that's kind of hard, isn't it?
Because I think there's our main reason that I signed up to the bootcamp is we've been using the LTEM framework with clients to sort of establish success metrics for the projects we're working on. But I sort of always felt that there was something missing. I wanted kind of Will's guidance on how to get the best out of the framework. And I think one of the things that he pointed out repeatedly throughout the bootcamp series is that you don't need to hit all of those tiers. I think it can feel quite overwhelming. You've got these 8 things that you need to measure, some of which are kind of complicated to measure depending on the topic that you're looking at. And it's also just like how much time you're willing to invest in it, what makes the most sense for your particular project. So if it's like a 6-figure leadership development program where the organization is investing a lot of resource in developing that, you probably want to spend quite a lot of time in evaluation to make sure that you are actually achieving something and you're changing behavior and having a positive impact. But if it's like it's a 2-minute explainer video, you probably don't need to spend that sort of amount of resource. But it's sort of, I think, seeing the different tiers within the framework as a kind of toolkit that you can draw on and different approaches that you can use in different contexts.
But is the ultimate aim always going to be 8? From Will's perspective, maybe not yours, but is that the message you get from him? Sorry, I'm farming all the information of you from the session. I'm going to go and do it, Will, I promise. I've decided now I'm going to do it. But, is always the aim to be getting to 8, to actual tangible change? Or is it enough to just get feedback from a learner that they're going to change, that they tell you they're going to change? Do you know what I mean? Like, is coming below 8 okay? Or I kind of always feel like we should be aiming high and then see where we get from there.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this a lot recently because it's awards submission season, presentation season. So
yeah, it's always good to have some tangible proof.
Yeah, so the question of like return on investment impact is front of mind because I know that judges will be wanting to see that. But then we were having a discussion on our team the other day. One of the projects that we're submitting this year is around management capability, and we have quite a cool innovative way, I think, of measuring that with kind of quantitative measures. But for a topic like management, which covers a range of complex behaviors. It's not as simple as measuring something like sales training or like engineering training or customer service training, where you've got kind of obvious quantifiable measures you can turn to. Similarly with DE&I training, just because you can't put a quantitative measure to, we did this DE&I training and therefore sales increased, or retention increased or something. Just because we can't do that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but it's then kind of bringing in qualitative measure or other ways of looking at it. And I think, again, it's always a case of what is pragmatic and practical for your particular project. And I think for a lot of the kind of smaller projects that we work on, I think we'll be looking at some of those learning tiers to come up with some sort of evaluation strategy for our clients, even if we don't necessarily get to tier 8, and maybe they're not that interested in measuring at tier 8, but we can in some way prove that people have learned something and then make improvements from there.
So yeah, in terms of awards, don't get me on my soapbox about charities awards. Oh, here I go. So we've been shortlisted and interviewed, and it just goes back. I 100% agree that they want to evaluate behaviour change, but we've really struggled when presenting, like a module on, that we've created that have helped children understand their own diagnosis for a condition or some sort of neurodiversity. And the award panel want us to show return on investment or, behaviour change. And they want statistical data for that. And that's really hard for us to do. It's hard for us to show anything other than feedback that says this has changed a child's life, that, that child can now go to school and advocate for themselves about what they, based on what they've learned. I don't know how to quantify that in a way that, demonstrates that in the way that award panels need. That doesn't mean I don't think it's really important, and it doesn't mean that I don't really want that for learners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm God of peace.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, again, in the boot camp, a book that Will recommended was The Tyranny of Metrics, which I've talked about on our podcast as well. And it's basically about our kind of collective obsession with quantitative performance metrics in various different fields and the kind of perverse or effects or unintended consequences that can have. So surgeons wanting to, maximize their success rate, not taking on tricky operations because that might affect their career prospects, or teachers teaching to a test because that's what their school is rewarded on financially, and that affects what they can do going forward, even though that's not really what education is supposed to be about. And the example you were sharing there, like, it's super hard to put a quantitative measure to that. It's not impossible maybe, but it's a longer term thing, especially with something like management. Example that I shared, it's not like you're taking like a program. You could have a really easy way of demonstrating return on investment at a sort of superficial level, where you could say, well, this existing program is a blended program, lots of face-to-face components, which were expensive. We converted everything to self-paced e-learning, and look at all this money we've saved the business. And if you just look at it at that level, that looks like a success, and you can be like, well, look at all this money. But if the intervention hasn't been designed in such a way that you're achieving the same kind of learning outcomes and performance outcomes, then is that as good a story as it seems on the surface? And I do think that as an industry, I think, because it's something I think we've been obsessed with for so long about not being good at quantitative measurement, I think there's almost like a little bit of a overcorrection in that direction sometimes, where if you can't show quantitative measurement, you must have done something wrong, or there's like some sort of deficiency. Whereas I think there are other ways of measuring the success of a project beyond bottom line numbers and hard statistics. But there's an appeal to those because it's, it seems objective, and it's often not as objective as it seems.
But also, I should point out, that that's what they want from a supplier.
Yeah,
we're going off tangent. I know that. I'm sorry, but but other people who are being judged are giving them that information. So as a judge, in their defence, they can't stack it up. They're asked for this. 3 of them have given it. this person hasn't, and they might love the project, might
Yeah,
think what we've done is amazing.
Criteria that they have to judge everything by.
But,
Yeah.
they can't score that one, and because we don't have that tangible data. Anyway, off tangent. One thing that I know that I'd like to talk to you about, and one thing that I think might be useful, particularly for delegates of eLearning Unlocked, is something around action mapping. I know, from our perspective, I feel it potentially lays the foundation for your evaluation. Is that something that you agree with? Do you?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned that we've long used the LTEM framework to help clients define success metrics for their projects and think about what they're trying to achieve. So as part of our scoping process, we would come up with, a set of project outcomes, would then work with the client to define KPIs around those, and then based on what it is we know we're interested in measuring, that then informs our approach to design. So I think people often think of measurement as this thing that you do at the end, but it's important to think about it at the beginning, because at the end it's kind of too late to think about it. But then also, if you think about it at the beginning, it affects the way that you approach the design of a particular program. So based on those outcomes and metrics, you then go through the action mapping process to think about, okay, what are the specific actions that you want learners to take in order to achieve this outcome that we've all agreed that we care about. And then from there, you could design practice scenarios. This would be kind of testing at tier 5 of the LTEM model to see if people can answer questions that respond to those scenarios. It's really difficult to write good practice scenario questions with realistic scenarios and different options. Patty Shank has a great book on writing good multiple choice questions, which I would recommend. But I think that's another thing. It's like, it's evaluation is complicated, and it's like, oh, okay, I'll look at tier 5, which is about decision-making competence, but you then need to be able to write good questions. And a lot of the questions you see in e-learning, most of them don't sort of follow those kind of best practice principles, and they're maybe testing at the sort of knowledge level, or they're maybe actually just testing people's ability to recognize patterns in how multiple choice questions are written. And
remember what they've learned in their 30s. Preaching to the choir, totally. I think that's really a perfect summary. We start with that measurable goal. So it's interesting that you come to it through KPIs, which is something, I'm going to reflect on for us. For me, without a measurable goal, I don't know how to design e-learning. You just don't know what's happening. I mean, I do know what's happening. You get asked to build a course on data protection or safeguarding, and you just produce any old thing.
Yeah.
You hand over the course, your job is done, here's a course. For me, it's all about the goal. We have to know what we're trying to achieve. We have to know what behaviour change. Otherwise, it's just a case of giving you a course and ticking a box.
Yeah, so we would typically, we would kind of start with that high-level goal, and then from there, we would kind of come up with KPIs or metrics at each level of LTEM, and then based on that collective goal and those metrics, we then think about, okay, now we can start action mapping, because these are the metrics we want to move, and so we want to kind of design the intervention in that direction.
It's really interesting to hear the way you're really embedding it in all of your design process. And I think that's, really something, interesting that we can all do and all think about. I think one of the things I liked about the process as well, though, is that it can give you a really good starting point. It's really easy to understand those layers.
Yeah.
And, I suspect that we can all learn more and dig in more and get, use it in a richer way. But I think anyone can take the model and understand the different layers and just get started. So, I think, they can kind of, I'm going to do this and this, and, it's a basis to get started and thinking about it.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it does feel like a toolkit that you can decide which tool is right for this task and which combination of tools is right for this task. And as you say, it does feel very practical. Like, I think if you're thinking seriously about learning measurement for the first time, I think this is a great framework. And although it is 8 tiers, which might sound like a lot, it's actually not that much when you sort of really drill down to it. And a lot of the stuff you'll already be doing in some way, but it's just sort of positioning it in a different way and thinking about it in the context of measurement and the story you want to be able to tell your partners in the business at the end of the program, to say, here's this thing that we did, here's what we're trying to achieve, and here's why we think it was effective based on these metrics.
One of the things that struck me when I was researching and kind of reading around is that Will's books is about writing good questions, and that's the focus. So, if you're doing the classic happy sheets, but you aren't asking the right questions, then you're not going to progress.
Yeah.
So, as you said, it's a good framework, but it's also about the questions that you're asking. Nonsense in, nonsense out. If you don't ask the right questions. So yeah, do get started. You'll get some insights, but it's really tweaking the questions that you ask is, to really hone them is.
Yeah, and one of the things that he says in his performance-focused learner surveys book is if you're asking a survey, so if you're designing some kind of post-intervention survey, don't ask a question that you have no intention of acting on. So unless you're going to do something with that data, there's no point in asking the learner further input on it, which I really like. It's definitely made me rethink the way that we sort of approach survey design.
It's like staff surveys, isn't it? When people get asked every year the same question, but nothing changes as a result. It's like that. It's the same principle. If you're going to ask the same thing every time, every program, and nothing happens, then people are going to stop engaging with the feedback form, let alone the process itself.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes back to did people like this thing? That's important because it affects your reputation in learning and development, and it also affects your reputation if you ask people for their feedback and then don't act on that feedback in a constructive way. So
yeah, I think we can be. I mean, it can be tempting, I think. I mean, I think that's true of everyone, but it can be tempting to ask questions that reinforce your own
biases.
Beliefs. I need you to like it. You told me that you didn't. That wasn't the correct answer here, people. So yes, I think as the creator of the thing in the first place, we need to be open and willing to change our own practice and not just reinforce, what we were doing, but, to be open to that change. I think one thing that we've kind of touched on, but I wanted to ask you more about, and the kind of thing I'm most jealous about with Mindtours is that you've got your own data and evaluation team in-house. So can you tell us a little bit about that and the kind of, where that slots into the process? I know obviously not all clients use that deeper exploration aspect, but I've heard of talk about some projects that you've done with them involved.
Yeah. So one of the projects that we're submitting for an award this year is a project on leadership development. We worked with a client in the travel industry. And as part of that, we collaborated with our in-house insights team, who are basically behavioral scientists, it's absolutely a luxury having them in-house and being able to draw on their expertise. But essentially how we approached that project is we started out by speaking to kind of key stakeholders within the client organization, including members of our target audience. Through that process, we're effectively coming up with what I like to think of as a set of assumptions about the problems that we're trying to solve. And then, so that would be the kind of L&D business stakeholders conversation. And then we're sort of stress testing those assumptions or validating those assumptions by speaking to learners and seeing if they actually resonate with them. And then from there, we develop what we call our outcomes framework. It's basically like a sort of storyboard or some a level below a storyboard. A sort of clear idea of what it is we're trying to achieve and the metrics we're trying to move. And then from there, we worked with Ghent on our insights team to develop a valid and reliable behavioral survey. So this is not like a learner satisfaction survey or the kind of survey you typically take at the end of a learning experience. It's a survey that's been designed based on measures which have been validated through academic research. So is valid if it measures what it claims to measure, and it's reliable if you assign me that survey today and you assign me again in 3 months, you would expect to get largely consistent results. So it's not kind of the time or randomness that's affecting the results of the survey. And so based on what we were trying to achieve, Ghent designed a survey looking at a sort of quantifiable way of measuring those metrics. We asked participants in the program to complete the survey before the intervention, and then we got them to do it again afterwards. And then to make sure, so we could isolate the effect of the program, we also got a control group to complete the survey at the same time. They also completed it before and after. And through a statistical significance calculation, which this is where Gent's expertise comes in, and I have not really any idea of how he did it, we believe that we're 95% certain that the behavior change that we saw, so we saw 12% improvement in the behaviors that we're looking to address on average across the sort of 6 or 7 behaviors we're studying. We believe there's with 95% certainty that that is not kind of a random effect, and it's as a result of the program, because with the control group, they actually got ever so slightly worse. I think they got worse by minus 0.47% or something like that. So essentially they stayed where they were, whereas the participants improved by 12%. So obviously that is something that most L&D teams don't have access to. I think it is something that's quite unique, and we're in a fortunate position to have that capability within Mind Tools. And as you said, not every client is going to have the desire or the budget to invest in something like that. I think, as I alluded to previously, this was like a big investment for the client organization, and so they really want to be certain if the thing that they'd done had a positive impact. But I think the really cool thing is we're taking the results from last year's cohort and then incorporating those into the design of the next phase of the program. We're then going to follow up with more measurement, and we're going to continue doing that over and over to kind of, in a cycle, continuously improve the program as we go forward.
It's so mind-blowing, so cool. Every time I hear you talk about this, I just, I'm like, I want one of those in my life. So
is very cool.
It's interesting, obviously, from your perspective as a practitioner, if that's what you call yourself. You must also learn a lot and be able to draw on what you've learned for other projects, but also kind of, testing out instructional design theories, and seeing how they work in practice.
I think it's great. Going back to what I said at the beginning of this episode, part of the reason I'm so obsessed with measurement is I want the kind of satisfaction that the job that I'm doing is actually useful. I think because we're a vendor, we're so rarely involved in that. Not every client will give us access to their data. Not every client is even that interested in measuring in this way, in this level of detail. And so to see that we invested all this time, the client invested all this time and resource in developing this, and it has actually delivered learning impact, it's very encouraging, I think, because we don't always get those kinds of stories. And so from that perspective, it's nice to know that this stuff actually works.
You don't need to go into any details, but do you feel like it's changed the way that you do things? Are you doing things differently in other programs as a result of what you learned from this one?
I think we're leveraging this more and more in the projects that we work on. So another project we're working on at the moment is around ESG. Specifically, it's about reducing the client organization's carbon footprint. They've committed to becoming net zero by 2031. And part of that is the carbon footprint of their employees. Now, you could, I think, through an action mapping process, come up with a series of actions or behaviors that would result in colleagues within this organization reducing their carbon footprint. But it'd be stuff like recycling more, or taking fewer flights, or eating a plant-based diet, or something like that. It's kind of things that people would already be familiar with, would have heard outside of this intervention that we're designing, and might not be that effective necessarily changing behavior. And so we got our insights team again to do literature review and to look at approaches from academia which have proven to be most effective at changing behavior in this space. And we uncovered a few insights as a result of that process that has then informed our approach again to content design. So, one of the kind of simplest things is that people are more likely to take climate positive action if they believe that others are too. So as part of it, we're building the experience around this like shared space where people will kind of share their individual carbon footprints. At least that's our intention. But also the steps that they're taking, the things that they're doing to have hopefully a positive impact on their carbon emissions. And that's not necessarily something we would have included otherwise. The other thing that we've uncovered is the sort of huge contribution of dark data, so like unused data in organizations, that makes towards carbon emissions. And again, it's like something that we wouldn't have thought necessarily to include, and we wouldn't have probably uncovered if we'd just gone through a kind of typical needs analysis or action mapping process. So I think we're drawing on that expertise more and more, and I think thinking about problems that other organizations or researchers have explored, which covers probably most L&D topics, and thinking, okay, we're not the first people to think about this. What can we learn from how other people have approached this in the past, and how can we, hopefully design something more successful and effective in the area?
Which neatly, as if we'd planned it, takes me to a question which obviously I'm fascinated by what you do, but it's a little unachievable for most people, including myself.
Yeah.
Because we don't have that internal expertise and resource. So it's a really good starting point, though, the kind of perspective you've given. And maybe that's the first tip that you would give, is that, it's not just about researching around the topic specifically, but it's about going bigger. It's about, not just looking at someone else's program on creating, reducing carbon footprint, but going outside that bubble and maybe the next bubble around it, and really starting to think about kind of holistically about behaviour change. So is there anything else that you can suggest an L&D person who's trying to do their best in evaluation but just hasn't got access to those additional resources? What would you suggest for them?
So I think we haven't really talked about AI. We managed to get through 40 minutes without talking about AI.
Yeah, it would happen.
But so Dr. Philippa Hardman has been doing a series on her newsletter recently about the future of instructional design as it relates to artificial intelligence. And she's talked about how one of the kind of key ways that AI can support instructional design, learning design, is through conducting or supporting literature reviews. So I think the idea of going out and reading lots of academic papers, that takes time. It's just a huge amount of resource, difficult to know where to start. I think that's somewhere where large language models can actually be pretty helpful and effective. At a simpler level, another way we've been using AI, this also came out of Will's bootcamp. I think this is about the 10th shout out I've given to Will in this episode. But when we're looking at
other boot camps are available,
other boot camps are available. Should give a shout out to Kirkpatrick as well. I feel like
no,
feel remiss. Yeah. But one of the things that Will talked about is when looking at the different tiers in the LTEM model is you can use a large language model like ChatGPT to help kind of brainstorm KPIs that you could map to each of those tiers. And I never thought of this before. I think I'd always, because we work in a consultative way with clients, I think my thought was, well, the KPIs have to come from the clients because they understand the context, they understand the problem we're trying to solve. But I think because they're so inside the problem, they don't necessarily think about it from this kind of sort of more objective or sort of outside perspective. And I've tried asking ChatGPT, stripping out any kind of details of the exact project, but like, I'm working on a project on X topic. Can you suggest some KPIs? And a lot of them will be not that interesting. It'll be stuff like, well, you might want to measure completion and engagement and stuff. But there'll also be things that I've not thought about that I then suggest to the client, and they think, oh, actually, we could measure that. So I think there's lots of ways that those tools can help people sort of get started with measurement. And then I think otherwise, it's just like, I think don't think of it as this like massive undertaking that you need to look at like every possible source of data. You need to have tons of different data points at each, or KPIs at each level of the framework. I think start small if you're new to evaluation, and if you're working with restricted resource, just think about it. I think maybe within the learning tiers, think about it in terms of how you're approaching your learning design, and how can you design experiences that, in the way they're designed, support measurement at the end of it. So if you're writing good scenario-based questions, you can, at the end of an assessment, say people have been able to answer good scenario questions, which suggests sort of decision-making competence. And we can say this number of people have completed it. This number of people have said they're likely to apply what they've learned back in their roles. I think that'll be enough for a lot of smaller projects. Yeah, every project doesn't need to have academic measures that have been validated through research in them.
But I also think what was really interesting when you're describing the transport project, one of the things you mentioned, and I know that it was done in a really scientific, research-based way, but it was those conversations with learners and, in your case, managers, and just that idea of talking to people. Yes, it won't be as deep and as scientific, but you can still talk to your subject matter experts or your learners and, describe a concept or an idea that you believe will work, and then have conversations with them. And get insights from them that you wouldn't have otherwise had. And, then you will be able to tweak and change your approach based on that.
No, 100%. And as a complement to the kind of quantitative measures that we had for that project, we did those focus groups. We did semi-structured interviews as part of the discovery process, but then we also did short follow-up interviews afterwards to get a sense of people's, I guess, more sort of like qualitative impressions of the experience and what they took away from it. And I think if people are thinking about doing focus groups or interviews, I think the key thing there is to try not to approach it in such a way that you're biasing the kinds of things that people are going to say. So yes, you're testing a hypothesis, but don't kind of ask questions in a way that will lead people to confirm your assumptions.
Yeah.
So the focus groups that we did for that project, we were asking really about people's perceptions and experiences of leadership at quite a high level, and then allowing them to kind of open that up or interpret that in the way that they wanted to, and then kind of seeing where that took us, because we sort of want our assumptions to be challenged to a certain extent or to explore perspectives that we might not have considered up until that point. So yeah, you can do a focus group super easily. 6 people. You want to do a few of them ideally, but doing one is better than doing none. It's always a good idea to speak to learners, so highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I hadn't reflected on that. Absolutely. You might have your own plan, but you don't just want to confirm your plan, because most people, you said, this is what we want to do. They just say, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And that's one of the things I kind of loved about Will's book, is at the beginning, he goes through this scenario where you're kind of imaginally having a conversation with the chief executive. And that chief executive says, but how will we know learners actually understand whether they've learned or not? How do we know that they're able to evaluate their own knowledge? And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that we can all go away and kind of reflect on. Listen, we've talked for hours and I absolutely loved it. I knew I would, and I've enjoyed every minute. But we need to wrap up now. So I kind of got one last question for you, which is something I try and ask fellow L&Ders, which is, how do you learn? What is it that keeps, how do you keep up your practice in this area? Now, I know you've been on Will's Bootcamp, but how did you know about that? What are the actions that you're taking to keep your professional development going?
So this is not a very...
Apart from doing Vitals Library of Resources, which I know you have played for.
Yeah, so we have a library of resources. This is not a very scalable answer, but honestly, hosting the Mind Tools podcast and writing the newsletter every week or every other week, because Ross does it some of the time as well, has been the biggest way that I've grown in my career, because it's put me into contact with people like Will. I mean, I know Will because of the podcast, but essentially that's just building a network. So you don't need to start a podcast or write a newsletter to do that. I think LinkedIn, I feel quite old saying this, but I think LinkedIn is my favorite social network now, which is just incredibly lame, but there's actually like real conversations that people are having within L&D space. There's lots of people trying to sell you something as well, but it's not hard to find genuine conversations around these kinds of topics within LinkedIn. And I think just kind of get involved does feel like a bit of an investment, but I think building your network, whether that's online or by attending conferences, listening to podcasts, subscribe to newsletters, I think basically anything that can kind of help you keep up with what others are doing is going to be to your benefit in the long run.
Yeah. And, maybe connecting your first point around the research you're doing for the podcast and the newsletter and that kind of reflective practice. Obviously what you're doing is really high quality, intense, thing that you're providing for us. Thank you. Love it. But then if we connect that with the idea of LinkedIn, maybe people could challenge themselves to write a LinkedIn post about a topic that they have to then go away and research. They can be open that I'm new to this, but it's a great way to build their network by actually giving out while also having to complete the task of learning so that you can write about it. I know that, writing E-Learning Unlocked with my colleagues, how powerful that's been for us. We have to, we had to do a lot of research to make sure that what we were saying was correct from a number of different perspectives. So people can do a kind of a micro level that themselves if they commit to it, via LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think the example that you just shared and the thing that shares with the podcast is there's some kind of commitment where we have to put out an episode every week. You've committed to doing E-Learning Unlocked. So it's like, how do you kind of make space in your working life to have kind of dedicated time? I think where there's some sort of commitment device to make you actually follow up on that. And you could do that through like an informal book group with your colleagues. So on the Mind Tools team, we've read Julie Dirkson's Design for How People Learn. It's kind of assigned reading. We've read the Patty Shank book that I referenced. That's just something that we do kind of every week or every other week, depending on how busy we are. And I think knowing that that's in our calendars, knowing that other people are going to have done it and are going to be showing up to that, expecting a discussion, it does sort of force you to make that time. Because I think day to day, it's really difficult to focus on long-term development like that. So the podcast sometimes, to be honest, is a pain because I'm busy. It's just one other thing that I have to do.
I can't imagine how you cope with it because it's so much work.
It's just one other thing to do, but it's I think if I didn't have that sort of commitment device there forcing me to do it, knowing that people are going to be showing up expecting me to ask hopefully good questions, then
and I've read the book.
Do the work. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and having read their book, I probably wouldn't have done the work. So I think whatever that looks like in your context, I think is
yeah. And I think the other thing, just kind of building on this, we talked about LinkedIn and we talked about, making that commitment to do that research. We've also kind of talked about, connections, but at the beginning of the conversation, you also mentioned this idea of presenting L&D as a high quality function. So maybe people could kind of commit to writing for their internal social or intranet pieces that are kind of promoting research around L&D and the importance of organizational development, personal development, productivity. So by doing that, I don't want to say thought leader, but you're presenting L&D as a function that's providing additional benefit and promoting why is that so important? Because L&D can make a difference, but we need to show that we're making a difference.
Yeah.
Evaluation is just part of that. It's also about how we present ourselves to the organization. Amazing. Thank you so much. Honestly, I have enjoyed every minute.
Same.
We could just go on and on, and I really hope to see you guys all soon. Yep. So thank you so much.